Nigerian military's ransom controversy, a mirror to insecurity and institutional vulnerabilities across Africa. Welcome to the Bold African Voice, BAV, your unfiltered lens into Africa's truths, tragedies, and triumphs. I'm Abdul Karim Kargbo, born and raised in Africa. From the forests of Katsina to encrypted chat rooms of retired generals, a story unfolds, one that exposes the hidden fractures in Nigeria's security system. While a retired general fights for his life in captivity, the powerful pull financial strings in silence. But who truly saved Tsiga, and who has been left behind in the shadows? Let's talk about it. In what has now become a compelling case study of Nigeria's security predicament and a broader reflection of Africa's governance challenges, the recent saga surrounding the kidnap and release of retired Brigadier General Mahrazu Tsiga has sparked national and regional debate. The dual narrative, one from retired military officials claiming that serving and retired officers raised ransom money, and the other from the Defense Headquarters, DHQ, insisting on the military's role in his release, reveals the complex and often contradictory nature of state responses to terrorism and banditry. This video critically examines the developments surrounding General Tsiga's release, compares similar security dynamics across Africa, and adopts a forward-looking approach to rethink security sector reform and citizen-military relations. The timeline. General Tsiga's 56-day captivity. General Mahrazu Tsiga, a former Director General of the National Youth Service Corps, NYSC, was kidnapped in the early hours of February 6, 2025, in Tsiga, Katsina State, a region repeatedly battered by banditry and terrorism. According to Brig General Ismaila Abdullahi, RTD, efforts to free Tsiga began with the creation of a WhatsApp platform where over 300 retired and serving officers allegedly donated money after the kidnappers demanded $400 million in ransom. In a viral statement published by Premium Times on April 8, 2025, Abdullahi claimed the contributions were pouring like August rains and credited this effort for the release of Tsiga. While Abdullahi did not disclose the exact sum paid or the modalities of the transaction, he declared that the collective initiative yielded a very positive outcome. However, Brigadier General Tukur Gusau, spokesperson of the Defense Headquarters, countered the narrative, accusing critics of undermining the sacrifices of troops involved in Operation Fansan Yama. He insisted that extensive air and ground operations had placed significant pressure on the terrorists, indirectly leading to the eventual release of General Tsiga. The troops nevertheless sustained the pursuit of the terrorists with unwavering determination. It is only fair to recognize the significant sacrifices made by these troops, said Brig General Gusau in a statement obtained by channels TV and Daily Trust. The core conflict, narratives of ransom versus rescue. The contrasting accounts highlight a credibility gap between the military establishment and a faction of its own former officers. This rift is not only symbolic, but symptomatic of deep-seated institutional weaknesses, a common feature in many African security establishments. The DHQ's defensive tone suggests discomfort with the perception that Nigeria's military cannot secure even its own former generals without succumbing to ransom payments. Meanwhile, the retired general's narrative, if true, raises troubling implications about the privatization of national security, where collective private funding becomes the only effective mechanism to rescue even high-profile abductees. This begs the question, if a retired general requires a social media fundraising campaign to secure his release, what hope exists for the average Nigerian? Africa-wide comparison, a shared burden. Nigeria's struggle is not isolated. Across Africa, the erosion of state monopoly on violence, increasing kidnap for ransom operations, and reliance on non-state solutions are recurrent themes. Cameroon. In the Anglophone crisis, families of kidnapped individuals often negotiate directly with separatist fighters in the absence of effective state intervention. Burkina Faso and Mali. The state has lost control over significant territories to jihadist groups. Local communities frequently raise funds to negotiate the release of abductees or to pay local militias for protection. Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC. Armed groups have capitalized on weak governance, with mass kidnappings often resolved through covert negotiations and unacknowledged ransom deals, often by NGOs or churches. Kenya. During the peak of al-Shabaab's cross-border raids, the Kenyan government was also accused of quietly paying ransoms through third parties to recover hostages, especially during the Garissa and Mandera attacks. In all these cases, what emerges is a crisis of confidence in state security apparatuses. Governments routinely deny ransom payments while quietly facilitating them through intermediaries, thereby failing to deter future abductions. The risk of normalizing parallel security structures. The Tsiga episode spotlights the institutional risk of normalizing parallel security arrangements, such as private donations, WhatsApp fundraising campaigns, and informal negotiation networks. These mechanisms may seem practical in the short term, but ultimately weaken the legitimacy of formal security forces and embolden criminal elements. Furthermore, the military's insistence on controlling the narrative, even in the face of contradictory facts, points to a culture of opacity and information management. In the age of digital transparency, such strategies often backfire, further eroding public trust. A forward-looking approach. What must be done? 1. Codify ransom policies. Nigeria and other African nations need transparent and enforceable laws on ransom payments, with clear guidelines for state and non-state actors. These should be paired with victim support funds to reduce public reliance on informal systems. 2. Strengthen civil-military collaboration. The Tsiga incident underscores the importance of public involvement in security, but this must be structured, institutionalized, and not left to WhatsApp forums. Community intelligence systems and formal civilian oversight of military rescue operations are essential. 3. National Security Accountability Board. African states should consider independent oversight bodies that can verify the outcomes of military operations, especially in rescue missions, to prevent propaganda battles between factions of the same institution. 4. African Union, AU. Intervention Strategy. The AU's Peace and Security Council must enhance its coordination to help member states build regional frameworks to combat kidnapping, including shared intelligence networks and rapid response task forces modeled after ECOWAS's standby force structure. 5. Public communication reforms. African militaries must reform their public information strategies. Instead of denying or downplaying realities, a balanced and transparent communication approach is key to building long-term credibility and public support. The bigger picture, from Tsiga to the tapestry of insecurity. What happened in Katsina is not just about one general or one ransom. It reflects a deep structural dilemma, where weak state institutions, emboldened non-state actors, and citizens caught in between define the security landscape. The tensions between official statements and ground realities are not merely semantic. They shape public perception, future response, and the strategic trajectory of national security. As this story unfolds, many questions remain unanswered. How much was really paid for Tsiga's release? Who coordinated the ransom handover? Why did it take 56 days despite military pressure? The answers, or the lack thereof, may shape the next phase of public debate in Nigeria and across Africa. What the Tsiga case reveals about the privilege divide in national security. Beyond its operational and institutional implications, the Tsiga case opens a sobering conversation about security privilege in Nigeria, and by extension, many parts of Africa. The rapid mobilization of both human and financial resources for one retired general contrasts sharply with the experiences of thousands of ordinary Nigerians abducted each year, whose families receive no such support or publicity. According to the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, ACLED, over 4,800 incidents of abductions were recorded in Nigeria alone, between January 2023 and March 2025, affecting over 25,000 people. In most of these cases, the victims were school children, farmers, traders, or commuters, people with no military ties or social capital to draw attention to their plight. It's not just about whether the military helped or not. It's about how society rallies to save one of its own when he's elite, while the rest of us are forgotten, lamented Halima Balarabe, whose 17-year-old nephew has been missing since December 2024 after being abducted on the Abuja-Kaduna Expressway. This case demonstrates that security access and response are largely stratified by class and status. It reaffirms a two-tier system, one for the powerful and another for the powerless. Digital mobilization and security governance. A new reality. The use of a WhatsApp platform to raise ransom funds introduces a new and understudied phenomenon in security governance: the digitization of informal rescue networks. Social media and encrypted messaging platforms are increasingly being used by civilians and elites alike to coordinate efforts that bypass traditional state channels. While this may reflect innovation and adaptability in the face of systemic failure, it also creates a governance vacuum. Who regulates these platforms? How are funds verified, documented, or audited? And what prevents criminal elements from infiltrating these networks? From Kenya's use of WhatsApp community policing groups in Nairobi's Eastlands to South Africa's Telegram-based neighborhood watch systems in Gauteng, African citizens are gradually replacing formal security oversight with peer-to-peer solutions, sometimes effective, often dangerous. In the Tsiga case, the military's discomfort with the publicized WhatsApp effort may not stem only from optics. It may also reflect an underlying institutional fear of losing monopoly over security narratives, and therefore control over national morale. The regional security matrix. Lessons for ECOWAS and African peacekeepers. For the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, currently facing multiple crises, from junta-led transitions in Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, and Niger, to cross-border terrorism and disinformation campaigns, the Tsiga incident provides an important lesson. State legitimacy is as much about perception as it is about performance. While ECOWAS has traditionally focused on political transitions and electoral diplomacy, its security apparatus must now evolve to account for hybrid security threats that blur the lines between terrorism, banditry, and organized crime. Public loss of faith in uniformed institutions, which threatens long-term regional cooperation. Unregulated non-state security arrangements that may become entrenched parallel systems. The case also calls for a revamped ECOWAS standby force doctrine, which currently prioritizes interstate conflict but is ill-equipped to address intrastate crises like mass abductions or community displacement due to rural insecurity. Women and children, the invisible victims of a broken system. While General Tsiga's release is commendable, it should not overshadow the ongoing humanitarian crisis unfolding across northwestern Nigeria. According to UNICEF Nigeria, over 200 school children have been abducted in northern Nigeria since 2020. Most are yet to be returned. Their stories rarely receive the national attention, military operations, or elite intervention that Tsiga's case triggered. The gendered nature of insecurity is evident in the stories of kidnapped schoolgirls from Chibok, Dapchi, and Tajina, many of whom have been subjected to forced marriages, sexual violence, or radicalization. These victims often return to communities without psychosocial support, education reintegration, or economic empowerment. The government's selective visibility in responding to high-profile cases while neglecting broader systemic failures creates a dangerous precedent. It emboldens criminal networks, reduces deterrence, and entrenches a culture of impunity. The media's role: watchdog, amplifier, or shield. This case also spotlights the evolving role of the media in shaping national security discourse. Platforms like Premium Times, The Cable, and Channels TV were instrumental in bringing the contradictory accounts to light. But beyond reporting, the media now stands at the intersection of truth, state propaganda, and public advocacy. In many African countries, the media is both a partner and a target of security forces. In Uganda, the media has faced censorship for reporting military failures in the fight against ADF rebels. In Ethiopia, journalists have been detained under anti-terror laws for covering Tigray-related hostilities. In Nigeria, journalists critical of military operations have faced intimidation and arrests under the Cybercrime Act and terrorism laws. To maintain its integrity, the Nigerian press must continue to verify competing security narratives through independent investigation, amplify underreported stories, especially of marginalized victims, hold public officials accountable, regardless of rank or retired status. As we await further clarification on the total ransom raised, the involvement of serving officers, and the breakdown of actual military intervention, the Tsiga case will remain a defining moment in how Nigeria, and Africa at large, responds to the growing tension between elite protection and universal justice. Psychological toll on military families and the burden of unseen battles. While much attention has been paid to the operational, institutional, and public relations aspects of General Tsiga's abduction and release, an equally critical yet overlooked dimension is the psychological toll on military families. Across Nigeria and the broader African continent, families of both active and retired service personnel live in a constant state of anxiety, not just about their loved ones' deployment, but increasingly about the threat of targeted violence and abductions in their homes. The Tsiga case has intensified fears within military families, who now realize that retirement is no longer a shield from harm, especially in areas plagued by insurgents, bandits, or terrorist networks. A brigadier general with decades of service to the nation, and a former DG of NYSC no less, can be abducted and held for 56 days without immediate resolution. What then is the fate of ordinary sergeants, lieutenants, and their families who lack the visibility, social capital, or digital networks to mobilize help? Mental health experts in Nigeria report a rise in trauma-related disorders among military families. According to the Nigerian Association of Clinical Psychologists, NACP, there has been a 35% increase in post-traumatic stress symptoms among military spouses and children between 2021 and 2024, especially in regions like Borno, Katsina, and Zamfara. Yet, military institutions across Africa, Nigeria included, often lack adequate welfare systems to support their personnel's mental well-being. Counseling services, trauma support, and community reintegration programs for veterans and their families are often underfunded, understaffed, or entirely absent. This void creates a cycle of emotional burnout, fear, and resignation, weakening the morale not only of troops on the ground but of the social networks they rely on for emotional strength. Rise of private security networks and the erosion of state sovereignty. One of the most alarming byproducts of the weakening faith in national security institutions is the proliferation of private security outfits and informal militia groups across Nigeria and many parts of Africa. As formal security becomes less effective or perceived as less responsive, citizens are increasingly turning to private solutions. Vigilante groups, community watch associations, and international private military contractors. In Nigeria, this phenomenon is reflected in the meteoric rise of private security firms, whose services are now being employed not just by the wealthy elite and expatriates, but by religious institutions, transport companies, and even local government councils. The Nigerian Security and Civil Defense Corps, NSCDC, estimates that over 1,500 licensed private security companies operate nationwide, with tens of thousands of unofficial community militias working in parallel, often with minimal oversight or training. This trend is not exclusive to Nigeria. In South Africa, private security personnel outnumber police officers by nearly 3-to-1, making it the largest private security market in Africa. In Mozambique, the government controversially turned to Russian Wagner Group and South African mercenaries to combat the insurgency in Cabo Delgado. In Libya, rival factions have enlisted foreign mercenary outfits, further complicating the prospects of national reconciliation. The growing reliance on non-state security actors raises questions about accountability, legality, and ethics. While these groups may fill a vacuum left by weak state forces, they also undermine the state's monopoly on the use of force, blur lines of authority, and create fertile ground for abuse and corruption. If left unchecked, this privatization of security could devolve into security fragmentation, where loyalty shifts from national constitutions to financial contracts, deepening state fragility in already volatile regions. Youth perception, insecurity, and the migration dilemma. For Africa's youth, the continent's largest demographic bloc, the Tsiga case is one more episode reinforcing the belief that neither the state nor its institutions can guarantee protection. This perception is directly linked to rising emigration trends, both legal and illegal, among young Africans who see migration not just as an economic escape, but a security imperative. According to a 2024 report by the International Organization for Migration, IOM, over 42% of Nigerian youth surveyed between ages 18 and 35 listed personal safety and insecurity as one of the top 3 reasons they would consider migrating, even at great personal risk. From Edo State's human trafficking routes to the desert trails of Niger and Libya, the desperation is evident. Stories like Tsiga's only serve to confirm for many that if generals are not safe, civilians are expendable. This sense of abandonment is not limited to Nigeria. In Cameroon, Anglophone youth fleeing political persecution continue to seek asylum in Nigeria and Ghana. In Somalia, insecurity and lack of opportunities push thousands to brave the Gulf of Aden in search of refuge in Yemen, despite its ongoing war. In Burkina Faso, youth in the Sahel region are increasingly being radicalized, not necessarily out of ideology, but due to disillusionment with the state's failure to protect them from jihadist incursions, as Africa's population is projected to reach 2.5 billion by 2050, with over 60% under the age of 25. Failing to address this security confidence crisis among youth will have dire implications for political stability, economic development, and continental cohesion. Political elites, selective outrage, and the question of national solidarity. The Tsiga narrative also highlights a troubling pattern of elite-centered outrage. When a high-ranking individual is affected, be it a general, a senator, or a politically connected businessman, media coverage is amplified, emergency meetings are held, and official statements flow freely. But when the victims are ordinary citizens, their suffering is often met with silence or tokenism. This reinforces a hierarchy of pain, where some lives are implicitly considered more valuable than others. Such a value system is antithetical to national unity and threatens to widen existing divides along class, ethnic, and regional lines. The Nigerian government, and indeed African governments at large, must reflect on this inconsistency. Solidarity must be inclusive, not selective. A security system that protects only the elite is not a national security system. It is a private service wearing a public uniform, ransom payments, military silence, and political legitimacy, eroding the foundations of governance. At the heart of the Tsiga case lies an inconvenient truth for African governments. The normalization of ransom payments, compounded by military silence or conflicting narratives, is chipping away at the legitimacy of state institutions. Political legitimacy is not solely derived from electoral mandates. It is also anchored in the ability of the state to guarantee safety, justice, and equality under the law. The moment a state appears incapable of protecting its citizens or relies on opaque, unofficial mechanisms to recover abductees, it begins to lose the moral high ground upon which public trust is built. The Tsiga episode, despite its high-profile nature, reveals that Nigeria, like many of its neighbors, is navigating a dangerous terrain where ad hoc solutions have replaced systemic responses, and elite exceptionalism undermines national cohesion. Even more disturbing is the lack of policy transparency around ransom payments. Governments often deny paying ransom publicly while covertly authorizing negotiations through intermediaries, leaving room for corruption, misinformation, and exploitation. This duality creates a credibility crisis that not only emboldens criminal networks, but also sows distrust among the governed, many of whom are victims or potential victims of similar insecurity. In Nigeria, despite repeated assurances by successive administrations, kidnap for ransom has evolved into a lucrative industry, with some estimates placing it as a multi-billion naira enterprise. It's no longer restricted to the fringes of insurgency, but has spread into urban centers, highways, and school zones, disrupting commerce, education, and social life. Africa's political landscape, the security legitimacy nexus. Across the continent, the link between security failures and political instability has become glaring. In Burkina Faso, mass civilian casualties and government inaction led to 2 coups in less than a year, with military regimes justifying their takeover on the grounds of protecting the population from jihadist violence. In Ethiopia, the Tigray conflict was exacerbated by trust deficits between the central government and marginalized communities, many of whom turned to armed resistance due to perceived security neglect. In Mozambique, the government's delayed response to the Cabo Delgado insurgency gave rise to international criticism and a loss of investor confidence, despite the region's vast LNG potential. In each case, the perceived inability of the state to provide security has triggered profound political consequences, including loss of legitimacy, international sanctions, mass displacement, and in extreme cases, regime change. Nigeria's civilian government, still recovering from the aftershocks of the Lani Ensar's protests and grappling with separatist agitations, cannot afford to ignore the erosion of public faith in state institutions. The Tsiga incident must be a wake-up call, not just for military reform, but for a recalibration of the entire governance architecture where transparency, responsiveness, and equality become central pillars of leadership. Policy recommendations toward an inclusive and accountable security framework. To reclaim legitimacy and restore faith in the state's ability to protect its citizens, a multi-tiered approach must be adopted. Based on lessons from the Tsiga case and comparative analysis across Africa, the following recommendations are proposed. 1. National Register and Response Framework for Abductions. Governments must establish a centralized, transparent system that documents all reported abductions, tracks rescue operations, and discloses whether ransom payments were involved. This will allow for better coordination, pattern analysis, and public oversight. 2. Institutionalized civil-military collaboration. Formal mechanisms should be developed to integrate civil society, local communities, and traditional leaders into security strategies, especially in high-risk areas. These platforms should have the authority to input intelligence, assist in humanitarian response, and participate in de-escalation efforts. 3. Ban on unauthorized ransom payments with legal exceptions. A national policy should prohibit ransom payments by unauthorized individuals while establishing a legal pathway for state-mediated negotiation under strict conditions. This could include the establishment of ransom oversight committees comprised of security, intelligence, and civil representatives to supervise any such negotiations. 4. Protection and compensation for victims and families. Create a national victim support fund, financed through national security levies, corporate social responsibility, and international donor contributions, to support the rehabilitation of kidnapped persons and compensation for families of those lost during rescue attempts. 5. Security sector reform with emphasis on accountability. Military and police forces must undergo comprehensive internal reforms with independent complaint review boards, psychological screening, performance audits, and whistleblower protection mechanisms. Media and civil society, engines of democratic vigilance. The media and civil society organizations must not be passive observers. They must continue to demand transparency in security operations, expose abuse or negligence by state actors, amplify the voices of underrepresented victims and communities, push for legislation that safeguards citizen rights and regulates non-state security actors. In countries like Ghana, where civil society has been instrumental in monitoring police reform, or Senegal, where journalists have helped unveil abuses during protest crackdowns, we see the power of free and fearless civic engagement in shaping public security discourse. In Nigeria, the Tsiga case should catalyze a broader national conversation, one that interrogates why the state continues to lose the trust of its people and what must be done to reverse that dangerous trajectory. Cracks in the armor, Nigeria's fragmented security architecture. As the Bold African Voice, BAV, continues to dissect the wider implications of Brigadier General Tsiga's abduction, one issue that demands immediate scrutiny is the lack of synergy within Nigeria's security apparatus. The conflicting accounts from the defense headquarters and the retired generals are not merely differences in opinion, they are symptomatic of deep structural and operational disunity among the various organs tasked with securing the nation. Nigeria's security sector is notoriously compartmentalized and bureaucratically bloated. It comprises the Nigerian Army, Navy, and Air Force under the Ministry of Defense, the Nigeria Police Force under the Ministry of Interior, the Department of State Services, DSS, reporting directly to the presidency, and specialized agencies such as the NSCDC, NIA, FRSC, and more. While each has its jurisdiction, the lack of effective interagency coordination, coupled with turf wars and overlapping mandates, often leads to inefficiency, intelligence hoarding, and delayed responses. In critical rescue operations like Tsiga's, these rivalries can cost lives. According to a 2023 report by the Center for Democracy and Development, CDD, over 58% of major security operations in Nigeria were hampered by interagency rivalry or operational disconnect. These include failure to share actionable intelligence, duplication of deployments, and contradictory public statements, just as seen in the DHQ versus retired generals narratives. The political military dissonance. At a deeper level lies the political military dissonance, where security agencies are not only fragmented among themselves, but are often caught between professional obligations and political directives. Military spokespersons must sometimes navigate the delicate balance of protecting the institution's reputation while aligning with political talking points, even when those conflict with facts on the ground. This creates confused communication, erodes public trust, and ultimately hampers the effectiveness of the very operations meant to keep citizens safe. Political interference also affects appointments, promotions, and resource allocations, further weakening morale and fostering a culture of allegiance to personalities over national interest. The Tsiga case, where one faction praises private fundraising and another insists on military heroism, is a prime example of how fragmentation and politicization can overshadow operational success, blur public perception, and obstruct strategic national security planning. The role of ECOWAS and the regional security response with transnational criminal networks, porous borders, and the rise of terror groups such as ISWAP, JNIM, and the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, ISGS. No West African country can afford to battle insecurity in isolation. The ECOWAS Standby Force, ESF, originally created to respond to regional conflicts and political instability, has yet to be optimized for civilian protection, anti-kidnapping strategies, and rescue logistics. In light of the Tsiga incident and similar abductions across the region, there is a growing case for an ECOWAS-led Kidnap Prevention and Rescue Task Force, EKPRTF, which can provide rapid cross-border intervention, tracking, and hostage negotiation capabilities. Enhanced intelligence fusion centers linking national agencies across borders to tackle criminal syndicates with regional operations. The establishment of a West African Victim Support Trust Fund, co-funded by member states, the African Union, and international donors, to ensure that victims of abduction are not left to fend for themselves or resort to elite-only fundraising models. If ECOWAS fails to lead from the front, The region risks the normalization of self-help security, where ransom culture and vigilante systems become the new governance structure, leaving formal institutions hollowed out and increasingly irrelevant. The battle for the narrative, information warfare, and state credibility. Another layer of this evolving crisis is the information war, a subtle but powerful struggle for control over public narratives. In the Tsiga case, the Nigerian Defense Headquarters was swift in issuing a rebuttal to Brigadier General Abdullahi's viral statement, not necessarily because the claims were false, but because they challenged the institution's image. This reaction is part of a broader trend where African governments have increasingly sought to control, suppress, or spin security-related information to protect political or institutional interests. While information management is a valid component of national strategy, it becomes dangerous when transparency is sacrificed for optics, false security is presented to cover failures, and citizen-driven initiatives are treated as threats rather than support systems. When ordinary people, retired officers, or victims begin to trust WhatsApp groups and informal rescue teams more than their government, it signals a legitimacy crisis of the highest order. For Nigeria and other African states, the task is clear. Reclaim the information space not by suppression, but by truth, accountability, and results. Citizens are no longer passive consumers of state narratives. They are active participants in documenting, debating, and judging national security outcomes. The moral question: who gets saved and why? Perhaps the most unsettling dimension of the Tsiga story is the moral question it raises. Why was a retired general rescued while countless other victims remain in captivity, forgotten, and abandoned? This question, though uncomfortable, must be confronted head-on. The military's swift mobilization, the viral fundraising, the media coverage, all these illustrate how social and institutional capital can determine the outcome of an abduction. This is not unique to Nigeria. From South Sudan to Chad, from the DRC to the Sahel, those who are connected survive. Those who are not perish silently. In democratic societies, the value of a human life must not be measured by rank, wealth, or social connections. When a state prioritizes some lives over others, it not only violates the social contract, it plants the seeds of resentment, rebellion, and long-term instability. The road to justice must begin with equity. Until every kidnapped child, teacher, farmer, trader, and commuter receives the same urgency, the same mobilization, and the same national outcry as a retired general, there will be no true security, only selective survival. The economics of insecurity, ransom, fear, and a shifting power structure. As the saga of Brigadier General Mahrazu Tsiga's kidnapping continues to unravel, it exposes a dangerous reality that extends beyond security protocols and state accountability. It delves into the booming economy of fear that has emerged across Nigeria and much of Africa. In many rural and urban communities, insecurity is no longer just a challenge. It is a thriving industry, with a chain of actors, from kidnappers to negotiators, informants to private guards, profiting from the perpetual absence of safety. Ransom as revenue, a parallel economy. Kidnapping for ransom has become a primary source of income for various criminal syndicates and terror groups. In the Nigerian context, particularly in the northwest and north-central zones, ransom has overtaken cattle rustling and drug trafficking as a preferred method of financing armed groups. According to SBM Intelligence, Nigeria's leading geopolitical intelligence platform, over N13 billion, approx $15 million, was paid in ransom between July 2020 and June 2023 across 582 documented abduction cases. Unofficial figures are believed to be significantly higher, as many families opt to settle quietly to avoid public and police scrutiny. The Tsiga case, with its massive donation drive and unconfirmed ransom amount, fits within this broader trend. Ransom payments are now normalized, crowdsourced, and even celebrated when successful. But this sets a dangerous precedent. For every ransom paid, incentives are reinforced, and for every high-profile rescue, hundreds of low-profile victims become bait. The revenue generated from these criminal acts is reinvested into the arms trade, recruitment of bandits, and bribery of local actors, thereby strengthening the very networks that threaten national stability. The security fear economy, profiting from panic. As insecurity escalates, entire parallel industries have emerged to meet public demand for protection, mobility, and escape. The consequences are reshaping local economies in subtle but powerful ways. 1. Private security firms. In Nigeria alone, more than 100,000 private security guards are deployed, many more than the actual number of active duty police officers. These firms charge fees ranging from N50,000 to N300,000 per month for domestic or business protection, creating a system where the rich buy safety while the poor rely on luck or divine intervention. 2. Transportation shifts. Long-distance road travel has sharply declined on major routes like Kaduna-Abuja, Lokoja-Okene, and Birnin-Gwari Zamfara as fear of abduction rises. Middle-class families now prefer domestic flights or hired convoys, shifting demand away from traditional transport unions and impoverishing drivers, traders, and mechanics who rely on highway commerce. 3. Real estate migration. There is a noticeable migration of the middle and upper class from volatile zones like Katsina, Zamfara, and parts of Plateau into relatively safer cities like Abuja, Lagos, or even Accra and Kigali. This has caused property prices to surge in urban safe havens, creating a new class of urban landowners and displaced rural renters. 4. Digital escapism and migration brokers. Tech-savvy youth in insecure zones are now turning to digital platforms to escape both physically and psychologically. Some enroll in coding academies to secure international remote jobs. Others pay illegal migration facilitators to flee to Europe or North America. The fear economy, therefore, is not just about staying safe. It is about finding an exit strategy. Winners and losers in the business of insecurity. Like every economy, the insecurity economy has its beneficiaries and victims. Those who win include kidnap syndicates who have expanded operations with greater sophistication, corrupt intermediaries, including some within law enforcement who collect cuts from ransom negotiations, private security companies whose services are in unprecedented demand, elite communities which now rely on technology and wealth to insulate themselves from risk. On the losing end, low-income families, especially in rural areas, are either forced to pay ransoms or endure prolonged disappearances. Public institutions, which face declining legitimacy and rising distrust. Small businesses, which suffer from reduced customer flow due to fear of attacks. Youth who grow up with trauma, hopelessness, and a sense of abandonment by the very government that should protect them. This wealth and power redistribution, where criminality pays and poverty is punished, is a time bomb. It breeds resentment, fuels radicalization, and widens the trust deficit between the people and the state. International dimensions, aid, intervention, and the global optics globally, Nigeria's insecurity crisis, and the rising profile of kidnap for ransom cases has caught the attention of foreign governments and international agencies, but responses remain cautious. Countries such as the United States, United Kingdom, and Germany have issued travel warnings, which harm tourism, foreign direct investment, and international partnerships. Meanwhile, donor agencies are under increasing pressure to shift funding from long-term development to short-term humanitarian and security interventions, which are less sustainable and more politically fraught. Multilateral organizations like the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, and the African Development Bank, AFDB, have proposed regional strategies to counter transnational organized crime, including anti-ransom frameworks, intelligence sharing platforms, and joint border patrol initiatives. But without domestic political will and regional leadership, especially from powerhouses like Nigeria, South Africa, and Egypt, such initiatives remain paper policies, lacking teeth, funding, or enforcement. The urgency of a new security social contract, the ongoing fallout from the Tsiga case, and the wider insecurity crisis makes it clear that Africa must redefine its security social contract. This requires answering three fundamental questions. 1. Who is responsible for protecting the people? 2. Who decides what protection looks like? 3. Who is held accountable when that protection fails? In the absence of honest answers to these questions, Africa's states risk governing empty shells, where legitimacy is symbolic and governance is performative. To change course, there must be a bold pivot from elite-centric security models to citizen-centered protection frameworks built on trust, accountability, and shared responsibility. This isn't just a matter of policy, it's a matter of survival. Surviving the shadows, voices from captivity, and the hidden wounds of abduction. As we continue our in-depth exploration into the kidnapping of Brigadier General Tsiga and the broader implications of ransom culture in Africa, the Bold African Voice, BAV, turns its lens to the survivors, the often silenced voices who have emerged from captivity with deep emotional scars, unresolved trauma, and haunting memories that rarely make it into public discourse. For every high-ranking military officer like General Tsiga who returns to a hero's welcome, there are thousands of ordinary citizens, students, traders, children, and civil servants, whose abductions pass without fanfare. Their stories paint a grim picture of the psychological toll of captivity, the indifference of state authorities, and the slow, painful journey toward healing in a society that is yet to fully understand the emotional dimensions of organized violence. Baro Garba's testimony, a glimpse inside the camp. Among the few first-hand accounts linked to the Tsiga case is that of Barau Garba, a schoolteacher who was abducted alongside the retired general. His emotional testimony, shared via military-released video clips, offers a rare and harrowing glimpse into the daily life inside the kidnappers' forest hideouts. We were blindfolded. We slept on bare ground. Food was not regular. They beat some of the younger captives to keep them quiet. General Tsiga was treated slightly better, probably because they knew who he was, Barau said. He described nights filled with the howls of animals, gunshots in the distance, and the ever-looming threat of execution if ransom negotiations failed. Though Barau was eventually rescued, the trauma lingers. He has not resumed teaching. His wife says he has become quiet, withdrawn, and paranoid, symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. The silent epidemic, post-trauma struggles and neglect. Unfortunately, Barau's experience is not unique. A 2024 survey by the African Center for Mental Health and Trauma, ACMHT, found that over 70% of former kidnap victims in Nigeria experience prolonged psychological distress, including anxiety, depression, insomnia, and recurring nightmares. Despite this, less than 10% receive any form of professional mental health support. Many victims face stigmatization, especially women who were sexually assaulted in captivity. In conservative communities, some return to shame, suspicion, or abandonment. They are seen as tainted, even though they are victims of a brutal system beyond their control. Children are not spared either. Victims of mass school abductions like those in Chibok, Dapchi, and Kagara report chronic fear, disrupted education, and a deep mistrust of adults. In many cases, abducted schoolgirls are married off to their captors, indoctrinated, or forced to bear children in the bush. The psychological wounds are profound, and yet state interventions remain minimal or tokenistic. There are no nationwide trauma response frameworks, no compensation systems for survivors, and very few specialized care centers for victims of prolonged abductions. Communities under siege, organizing for survival. In the absence of sustained state protection, local communities are taking matters into their own hands, forming self-defense networks and informal vigilance groups to fill the security vacuum. In parts of Zamfara, Katsina, and Kaduna, groups like the Yan Sakai, volunteer vigilantes, have sprung up to patrol villages, monitor strangers, and repel bandit attacks. However, their operations often straddle the line between community protection and extrajudicial justice, sometimes leading to human rights abuses and cycles of revenge killings. Elsewhere, rural women's groups have mobilized to create safe zones during planting and harvest seasons using whistle alarms, forest guides, and mobile patrols to protect farmers, many of whom now refuse to work their land for fear of abduction. These self-organized mechanisms reflect both resilience and desperation. While communities are doing what they can, the underlying message is damning. The state has abandoned its protective duty, and citizens have been left to improvise security under dangerous conditions. Faith, fear, and the role of religious institutions. In a deeply religious country like Nigeria, faith-based organizations have become central to post-abduction recovery, offering not just prayers but shelter, counseling, and fundraising support for ransom payments. Churches and mosques in regions affected by insecurity have become hubs of resistance and healing, with some pastors and imams playing dual roles as spiritual leaders and informal negotiators. In the Tsiga case, insiders reveal that religious leaders from Katsina State provided moral and logistical support to the family, especially during the emotional low points of the 56-day ordeal. However, this growing dependence on faith-based interventions also reveals a dangerous trend. Faith is increasingly compensating for the absence of functional governance. Religious bodies are being overwhelmed, often stepping into roles traditionally reserved for the state. Mental health support, displacement aid, and even hostage negotiations. Without proper institutional collaboration, this model is unsustainable and risks being exploited by criminal groups who may see faith institutions as intermediaries of ransom flow. Cultural narratives: how society tells the story of the kidnapped. How society responds to abductions is not just about action, it's also about narrative framing. The way media, leaders, and communities talk about victims can either uplift or isolate them. In many African cultures, those who return from captivity are often expected to forget and move on. Public sympathy is usually brief, and structural reforms rarely follow. Meanwhile, the cultural storytelling of these incidents tends to romanticize elite rescue stories while downplaying or ignoring everyday tragedies, silence survivor testimonies, especially when they involve abuse or failed state responses, villainize victims who are perceived to have cooperated with captors, particularly in cases where survival required compliance. This selective narrative framing is not just unjust, it actively reinforces societal apathy and discourages critical dialogue on systemic change. Insecurity and the ballot: the political cost of fear in African democracies. As the Bold African Voice, BAV, continues this multi-part exposé on insecurity and its ripple effects across the continent, we now pivot to one of the most consequential dimensions of the crisis: the political cost of unchecked violence and public fear on democratic participation and legitimacy. From Nigeria to Mozambique, Mali to the Central African Republic, insecurity is no longer just a governance issue. It is now a defining electoral force, influencing who votes, who wins, and how political authority is perceived by the masses. Nigeria's elections and the shadow of the gun. In Nigeria's 2023 general elections, insecurity played a decisive role, not only in the voter turnout, which was a historic low at just over 27%, but also in the credibility of the vote in many volatile regions. Entire communities in Zamfara, Katsina, Borno, and Niger states were unable to vote due to banditry, Boko Haram activity, and fears of violence at polling stations. Observers from the European Union Election Observation Mission, EU-EOM, and the Carter Center noted that insecurity suppressed political participation, disproportionately affecting rural voters and internally displaced persons, IDPs, many of whom were unable to register or access polling units. The result was regional disenfranchisement, leading to questions about the representativeness of the final outcome. The Tsiga incident further reinforces the perception that protection in Nigeria is stratified by class and rank. As ordinary citizens grapple with daily insecurity, political elites continue to campaign, vote, and govern under heavy security, creating a deepening trust gap between the rulers and the ruled. Electoral weaponization of insecurity. Across Africa, politicians have learned to weaponize insecurity for electoral advantage. In some contexts, incumbent leaders frame themselves as the only viable guarantors of stability, warning that opposition parties would hand over the country to chaos if elected. In others, opposition figures highlight security failures to undermine the legitimacy of the sitting government, often with little concrete alternative strategy. This creates a dangerous binary where voters are forced to choose between the status quo, which may offer predictability but no real improvement, or uncertain alternatives, often lacking a clear roadmap for dealing with the security crisis. In Burkina Faso, the failure of two civilian governments to curb jihadist violence paved the way for back-to-back military coups in 2022. In Mali, the junta under Assimi Goïta justified its seizure of power with promises to tackle terrorism and reclaim state sovereignty, popular rhetoric that resonated with many frustrated citizens despite the long-term implications for democracy. In Cameroon, the government's protracted conflict with Anglophone separatists has become a permanent feature of its political calculus, used to justify militarization, internet shutdowns, and the postponement of elections in affected regions. When people stop believing in democracy, there is perhaps no greater threat to Africa's democratic trajectory than the gradual realization by its citizens that democracy is not delivering security, justice, or prosperity. When elections come and go, and the abductors still roam free, when new presidents are sworn in but old wounds remain untreated, people begin to disengage. This democratic disillusionment is visible in low voter turnouts in insecure regions, public apathy towards political campaigns, the rise of strongman nostalgia, where citizens yearn for authoritarian figures perceived to have gotten things done. For example, in Nigeria, some communities have resorted to traditional rulers or local warlords for dispute resolution and protection, undermining the authority of elected officials. In the Sahel, some youth view jihadist groups as more reliable providers of justice and order than the absent or corrupt state. This shift is not ideological, it is rooted in survival logic. Unless African democracies find a way to institutionalize security as a core dividend of governance, they risk a slow descent into citizen disengagement, legitimacy collapse, and eventual systemic failure. Hope in resistance, grassroots political movements rising. Despite these challenges, there are signs of resilience. Across the continent, grassroots political movements, led by youth, women, and civil society, are pushing back against the normalization of insecurity and impunity. In Nigeria, movements like Trark Secure North, NSARS, and North is Bleeding have emerged as digital and physical platforms demanding government accountability. These campaigns reflect a growing awareness among younger Africans that silence is complicity and that sustained insecurity is not just a military failure, it is a political betrayal. Similarly, in Kenya, local advocacy groups in volatile counties like Turkana and Samburu are mobilizing communities to track violence patterns, document state inaction, and demand localized security solutions during elections. In Congo DR, church networks and civil society groups have organized citizen peace councils, which not only provide safe spaces for dialogue, but also pressure provincial governments to act more decisively in protecting voters. What these movements reveal is that citizen power remains a potent force, but it must be nurtured, protected, and legitimized by states that are willing to listen and reform. The stakes ahead: security as an electoral mandate. With over 15 African countries heading to the polls between 2025 and 2026, including Ghana, Chad, CAR, South Sudan, and Burkina Faso, the stakes have never been higher. For these elections to be credible, inclusive, and democratic, security must be a non-negotiable prerequisite. Displaced persons must be reintegrated into the electoral process. Election management bodies must factor insecurity into their logistics and outreach strategies. Regional bodies like ECOWAS, AU, and SADC must prioritize election security frameworks and rapid response teams that can intervene before, during, and after elections. But above all, African leaders must understand that no electoral victory is meaningful without legitimacy, and no legitimacy can be sustained in the face of violence, fear, and abandonment. Digital darkness, how technology is transforming the kidnap for ransom industry in Africa. As the Bold African Voice, BAV, continues to explore the evolving dimensions of insecurity in Africa, anchored around the Tsiga kidnapping saga, we now examine how technology is reshaping the landscape of organized abduction and ransom negotiation. The digital age, which promised connectivity and innovation, is also providing new tools for criminals to operate with precision, speed, and anonymity, while governments struggle to adapt outdated security frameworks to meet the challenge. Encrypted messaging, the kidnapper's safe haven. One of the most notable shifts in recent years is the adoption of end-to-end encrypted platforms by criminal syndicates. Applications like WhatsApp, Signal, Telegram, and even Facebook Messenger are now commonly used by kidnappers to initiate ransom negotiations without being tracked, send proof-of-life videos or voice notes, coordinate logistics with informants inside and outside urban areas. In the Tsiga case, the very platform used by retired generals to raise funds, a WhatsApp group, mirrors the same toolset leveraged by criminal networks to evade law enforcement. The irony is striking. Both sides of the conflict, victims and perpetrators, are relying on the same digital infrastructure, but one is shielded by anonymity, while the other is exposed. Law enforcement agencies in Africa are ill-equipped to penetrate encrypted communications without violating international privacy standards. This has created a paradoxical dilemma: uphold digital rights and risk operational setbacks, or pursue aggressive surveillance and risk public backlash and legal consequences. Cryptocurrency and untraceable payments. Another alarming trend is the increasing use of cryptocurrency in ransom transactions. While Nigeria, for instance, has banned the use of cryptocurrencies for official financial services since 2021, underground transactions continue to flourish, particularly through peer-to-peer, P2P networks, and international exchanges. In a number of recent kidnap cases, especially those involving foreign nationals or high-net-worth individuals, ransom payments were reportedly demanded in Bitcoin, Ethereum, or Monero, all of which offer degrees of anonymity that make tracking incredibly difficult. A 2023 joint report by Interpol Africa and Chainalysis noted that ransomware and physical abduction groups in West Africa had received over $11 million in crypto payments over a 2-year period. Some of these funds were later traced to known terrorist-linked wallets, further complicating counterterrorism financing efforts. Unless African states develop clear regulatory frameworks for crypto oversight, bolster cyber forensic capacities, and collaborate with global crypto exchanges, they will remain vulnerable to a fast-growing shadow economy that empowers criminals and disarms authorities. Social media surveillance and target selection. Perhaps even more chilling is how criminal groups now use open-source digital intelligence, OSINT, to select and monitor potential targets. Social media platforms, especially Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and LinkedIn, offer rich data about family wealth and lifestyle, travel patterns and routines, home locations and school addresses, business networks and affiliations. In a disturbing case reported in Kano State in late 2024, a businessman's teenage daughter was kidnapped after she posted videos of her father's luxury vehicles and their vacation home. The abductors used this content to calculate the family's ability to pay ransom and track their movement over time. This illustrates the need for a public awareness campaign around digital safety, especially targeting youth and middle-class families who unknowingly expose themselves through online content. Digital footprints have now become kidnapping blueprints. Governments falling behind, the cybersecurity gap. Despite the high stakes, most African governments remain woefully underprepared for the digital evolution of criminal networks. National cybersecurity strategies, where they exist, are often outdated, underfunded, and plagued by poor coordination between national security agencies, communication regulatory bodies, financial intelligence units, and internet service providers. Nigeria's Computer Emergency Response Team, NGCEART, for example, lacks the human resources and legal authority to conduct proactive investigations into encrypted digital threats. Meanwhile, the country's Cybercrime Act of 2015, while a foundational law, does not address the complexities of cryptocurrency crime or AI-generated identity masking, both of which are now commonplace in sophisticated kidnapping operations. Even regional frameworks such as the African Union Convention on Cybersecurity and Personal Data Protection, Malabo Convention, have not been ratified or domesticated by a majority of AU member states, leaving huge legislative gaps. Digital justice, the untapped power of tech in fighting crime. While technology is enabling new threats, it also holds immense untapped potential for solutions. If governments are willing to invest in smart, rights-respecting, and community-driven strategies. Some innovative paths forward include 1. AI-powered crime mapping and predictive policing. Governments can partner with tech firms to develop tools that use historical data, satellite imagery, and AI models to predict high-risk abduction zones, enabling better resource deployment and early warnings. 2. Blockchain-based ransom tracking. With proper regulatory collaboration, blockchain analysis tools can be used to trace crypto ransom flows, helping authorities identify networks and eventually freeze illicit assets. 3. Community reporting apps with encryption. Mobile apps that allow anonymous reporting of suspicious movements or suspected abduction plans, particularly in rural areas, can empower citizens to become frontline informants without risking their safety. 4. Digital literacy campaigns on safe online behavior. Public service initiatives must educate users, especially youth influencers and professionals, on how to control visibility, manage digital identities, and avoid oversharing, which can make them soft targets. From shadows to surveillance, a digital turning point. The evolution of the kidnapping industry into the digital domain is not just a tactical shift, it is a paradigm transformation. Africa's security strategies must evolve beyond boots on the ground to codes on the cloud. This requires visionary leadership, transnational cooperation, and citizen buy-in. If technology is the new battlefield, then governments must learn to fight smarter, not harder. They must own the digital terrain, not just as regulators, but as innovators and protectors. Only then can the continent begin to dismantle the kidnapping cartels that thrive in the shadows of its ungoverned digital spaces. The Forgotten Faces, Africa's growing crisis of the missing and disappeared. As we continue with the Bold African Voice, BAV's ongoing exposé into the crisis of insecurity, the digitalization of ransom culture, and its corrosive effects on African societies, we now shift our focus to a heart-wrenching reality that rarely receives sustained national or international attention: the growing number of missing persons whose fates remain unknown and whose families remain trapped in grief, silence, and unanswered questions. While high-profile cases like Brigadier General Mahrazu Tsiga receive public mobilization and institutional response, the majority of kidnapped victims in Africa are never located, never ransomed, and never returned. For these families, every passing day becomes a torment of hope and despair, a psychological imprisonment with no resolution. The scale of the tragedy, vanishing without a trace. In Nigeria alone, the National Human Rights Commission, NHRC, reported in late 2024 that there are over 1,500 unresolved cases of missing persons, with some dating back more than a decade. These include kidnapped for ransom victims, internally displaced persons separated during terror attacks, victims of police or military raids, migrants who vanished en route to Europe or North Africa. The International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, puts the number much higher, citing over 25,000 active cases of missing persons in Nigeria, making it the highest on the African continent. The reality is, many of these people are presumed dead, but without confirmation, families are denied closure, denied mourning, and denied justice. In communities across Benue, Zamfara, Borno, Plateau, and Kaduna, entire families live in suspended emotional states, keeping empty beds, unwashed clothes, and open prayers for sons, daughters, and spouses who may never return. The bureaucracy of pain, institutional apathy, and red tape. One of the most frustrating aspects for families of the missing is the absence of an effective institutional process for tracing, documenting, and resolving cases. Most African countries lack a centralized missing persons database, DNA banks to match remains with family samples, proper post-mortem documentation systems, or even legal mechanisms for declaring someone legally dead after disappearance. Instead, families are bounced between police stations, local government offices, and humanitarian agencies, often forced to recount traumatic events over and over, with little to no action taken. In Nigeria, the creation of the National Missing Persons Register, NMPR, in 2021, supported by the ICRC and NHRC, was a critical first step. But implementation has been slow and fragmented, with many state police commands still operating paper-based records and lacking dedicated personnel for missing persons investigations. The psychological aftermath. A trauma with no expiry date. Unlike the finality of confirmed death, ambiguous loss, a term used in psychology to describe grief without closure, is a uniquely torturous form of suffering. It produces symptoms of chronic anxiety, complicated grief disorders, social withdrawal, and even suicidal ideation among survivors. For many African families, particularly those without access to mental health services, the emotional weight is compounded by cultural expectations to move on and societal pressure to avoid bringing shame or stigma to the family, especially when the missing person is a female suspected of sexual violence in captivity. Some families also face extortion by fake negotiators, criminals who call claiming to have the missing person and demand a ransom, only to vanish after payment. This adds financial ruin to emotional devastation. Unclaimed bodies and mass graves. When justice is denied. In many cases, victims of abductions are killed and buried in shallow, unmarked graves, or their bodies are abandoned in remote forests and conflict zones. Local communities often discover decaying remains long after the crime, and due to lack of forensic capacity, these bodies are buried without proper identification. The absence of forensic infrastructure, including body storage, DNA matching, and crime scene analysis, means that hundreds, if not thousands, of victims become statistics, not identities. Families are denied the ability to grieve properly, and perpetrators walk free, emboldened by the culture of impunity. In 2023, a mass grave discovered in Zamfara was believed to hold over 40 bodies, presumed to be abductees executed by a bandit cell. To date, not a single person has been formally identified, and no arrests have been made. This represents not only a humanitarian crisis, but also a judicial failure, where death occurs without evidence, witnesses, or accountability. The cost of forgetting, a society haunted by silence. The danger of letting the missing become invisible is not only moral, it is societal. Each unsolved disappearance erodes public trust in state institutions, weakens the rule of law, encourages criminal syndicates to act with impunity, and creates intergenerational trauma that festers beneath the surface. In cultures where communal memory and storytelling are sacred, the inability to account for lost family members ruptures the social fabric, replacing oral histories of resilience with whispered rumors of tragedy. Communities that once found strength in unity now suffer collective trauma, marked by fear, paranoia, and withdrawal from civic life. In the long term, These are the very conditions that fuel radicalization, vigilante justice, and separatist movements. Path forward, honoring the missing and preventing more. To address this growing humanitarian and security crisis, African governments, civil society, and international partners must prioritize. 1. A Continental Missing Persons Protocol. The African Union should establish a binding protocol on missing persons, requiring member states to set up national registries, victim tracing units, and family support mechanisms. 2. Forensic infrastructure investment. National and regional bodies must invest in forensic science facilities, DNA labs, morgues, mobile exhumation units, and professional training to identify remains and provide closure. 3. Legal reforms on disappearances. Countries must enact laws that allow families to seek justice for disappearances, declare missing persons legally dead after a specified time, and claim reparations if state negligence contributed to the loss. 4. Community reporting and protection channels. Establish anonymous hotlines, SMS platforms, and local liaison officers for families to report missing persons without fear of reprisal or extortion. 5. National Day of the Missing Countries should honor the disappeared with an annual day of remembrance, an opportunity to raise awareness, pressure authorities, and commemorate lives cut short or lost in silence. Geopolitics of silence. How regional and global actors enable Africa's insecurity crisis. As the Bold African Voice, BAV, continues its comprehensive investigation into Africa's spiraling insecurity crisis, we now turn to an often overlooked but critical dimension: the role of regional and international actors in shaping or stalling effective responses to the escalating wave of abductions, disappearances, and violent disruptions across the continent. While African governments bear primary responsibility for protecting their citizens, the global and continental responses to Africa's insecurity have ranged from strategic silence to performative diplomacy, shaped not by humanitarian urgency, but by economic interests, geopolitical calculations, and reputational management. The African Union's paralysis. Diplomacy without teeth. Established with the mantra of African solutions to African problems, the African Union AU has, in theory, the infrastructure and mandate to act decisively on human rights violations, terrorism, and state failure. Yet in practice, the AU has often fallen short of meaningful intervention, especially in crises involving mass kidnappings, state-sponsored repression, or systemic security collapse. In the case of Nigeria's banditry and kidnapping crisis, including high-profile incidents like General Tsiga's abduction, the AU's response has been muted, if not completely absent. Despite repeated alerts from civil society organizations, regional blocs like ECOWAS and the AU's Peace and Security Council, PSC, have treated Nigeria's internal insecurity as a domestic affair, avoiding direct censure or coordinated pressure. This silence is not accidental. It stems from a long-standing culture of non-interference, where political solidarity among African heads of state often overrides the urgency to act. As a result, victims of abductions and disappearances find no recourse beyond national borders, while perpetrators operate knowing the continental system is unlikely to respond. Ironically, while the AU is quick to condemn military coups or unconstitutional changes of government, it has been consistently slow to act on prolonged civilian-led governance failures, especially when these failures manifest as unchecked violence and institutional decay. The role of ECO was, from regional watchdog to selective enforcer. The Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, a key regional bloc with security and diplomatic mandates, has shown flashes of bold action in response to constitutional crises, most recently in Niger, Guinea, and Mali. Yet when it comes to sustained insecurity, especially in northern Nigeria, Burkina Faso, or northern Côte d'Ivoire, ECOWAS has largely limited its engagement to press statements and ad hoc meetings. Its mechanisms for conflict prevention and peace building, such as ECPF, ECOWAS Conflict Prevention Framework, have not been fully leveraged to address kidnapping syndicates, transnational armed groups, or the humanitarian fallout of mass abductions. Critics argue that ECOWAS has allowed itself to become a political club of elites, more concerned with preserving state power than protecting vulnerable populations. Without a clear political will to enforce community-based security protocols or establish regional rapid response units for hostage crises, ECOWAS risks becoming irrelevant to those it was designed to serve. The UN's double standard, when the world decides who matters, the United Nations, UN, while foundational in establishing global norms for peace and security, has been selective and sporadic in its engagement with Africa's internal security crises. Mass abductions, such as those in Nigeria, Cameroon, or the DRC, rarely trigger emergency Security Council sessions, humanitarian airlifts, or widespread international media outrage unless foreign nationals or strategic interests are involved. Compare, for example, the rapid global response to the kidnapping of Western tourists in Kenya or Burkina Faso versus the muted global reaction to the abduction of hundreds of African schoolgirls in Chibok or Niger State, even after their plight became internationally known. This disparity has led to accusations of racial and geopolitical bias, where African victims are deemed less worthy of urgent intervention than their Western counterparts. The UN's counterterrorism programs, including the UNOCT, UN Office of Counterterrorism, have made inroads in technical support and coordination. However, these efforts often remain elite-focused, with little visibility or direct benefit to communities ravaged by daily insecurity. Foreign governments, strategic partnerships, or complicity by silence, bilateral partners like the United States, United Kingdom, China, Russia, France, and Turkey all maintain security or economic partnerships with African states. Yet, few of these relationships have resulted in meaningful pressure on governments to end systemic abductions or invest in justice for victims. For instance, France's military operations in the Sahel, Operation Barkhane, now replaced by other missions, focused heavily on counterterrorism but paid little attention to civilian kidnappings or non-jihadist insecurity in Nigeria or Chad. U.S. military assistance programs, while robust, have often prioritized training elite counter-terror units while overlooking community defense or victim recovery frameworks. China's Belt and Road Initiative, although economic in nature, has led to silence on human rights abuses, including in regions where Chinese interests are protected by governments accused of suppressing dissent and tolerating insecurity. This pattern suggests a broader global willingness to tolerate local instability, so long as strategic or economic interests are not directly threatened. The politics of visibility. When injustice makes the news, global attention is a currency in international diplomacy, but it is unevenly distributed. The kidnapping of General Tsiga, for instance, drew modest regional coverage and statements, but it lacked the international viral momentum of events like the Chibok girls' abduction in 2014, which captured global imagination due to high-profile advocacy by celebrities and politicians, viral campaigns like Jalko Bring Back Our Girls, and strategic amplification by international media houses. But such visibility is rare, short-lived, and highly politicized. Most abductions, including those of internally displaced villagers, children in farming communities, or traveling clergy, go unreported and unrecognized beyond local radio or WhatsApp groups. This visibility gap not only deprives victims of global solidarity, but also denies pressure mechanisms that could compel governments or global bodies to act. What true international solidarity looks like. To move beyond symbolic gestures and geopolitical performance, international and regional actors must commit to concrete, victim-centered actions including 1. Dedicated UN Special Rapporteur on Kidnappings and Disappearances in Africa. A monitoring mechanism under the Human Rights Council to track, report, and intervene in persistent abduction zones. 2. AU-led Regional Security and Victim Support Fund, financed by member states, the Diaspora, and global donors, This fund would provide legal, psychological, and financial assistance to families affected by abductions and disappearances. 3. Sanctions against complicit local actors. Impose travel bans, asset freezes, or visa restrictions on political or military officials found to be aiding or ignoring abduction networks within their jurisdictions. 4. Diplomatic conditionality. Tie military aid, security partnerships, and bilateral trade benefits to verifiable human rights benchmarks and civilian protection reforms. 5. Global Civil Society Coalition for the Missing in Africa. A network of African and international NGOs, survivor networks, journalists, and legal aid groups to push for justice, memorialization, and policy change. Diaspora Rising, Africa's global citizens on the front lines of resistance and resilience. In continuing this extensive investigation by the Bold African Voice, BAV, into the dynamics of insecurity, kidnapping, and institutional silence across the continent, we now focus on a group often underestimated in traditional security discourse, but increasingly influential in the fight for justice and accountability, the African diaspora. From London to Toronto, Atlanta to Berlin, Johannesburg to Doha, Africans in the diaspora have moved beyond remittances and cultural preservation. They have become powerful voices of advocacy, economic lifelines, digital mobilizers, and creators of alternative narratives in response to the rising tide of insecurity back home. Beyond remittances, funding resilience and recovery, the African diaspora contributes over $95 billion annually in remittances, according to the World Bank 2023, a figure that exceeds all foreign direct investment and official development assistance combined. But beyond supporting family incomes, a growing share of this money now goes to informal security coping strategies, paying ransoms for abducted relatives, relocating endangered family members to urban centers or abroad, funding local vigilante groups and community patrols, supporting trauma therapy and medical recovery for returned victims. In the case of Brigadier General Tsiga's abduction, BAV investigations found that diaspora-based retired military officers were among the most active donors to the fundraising platform coordinated via WhatsApp. Some reportedly contributed thousands of dollars anonymously, motivated by shared fraternity, patriotism, and a sense of institutional duty unmet by the state. This flow of support is now systematized across multiple crisis zones. In northern Cameroon, the diaspora funds local safe houses for abductees fleeing Boko Haram captivity. In the DRC, Congolese abroad sponsor mobile schools and trauma counseling for rape victims in conflict-ravaged Kivu. But this form of resilience funding, though noble, cannot replace a functioning state. Without proper regulation and accountability, it also risks feeding parallel security structures and creating long-term dependency. Digital warriors, mobilizing global attention and action. Where local press is censored or muted, diaspora Africans have used social media and online platforms to expose insecurity and rally global support. Hashtags like EndSARS, Nigeria, Bring Back Our Girls, Shut It All Down, Namibia, Congo is Bleeding, and Justice for Zamfara have all been amplified by diasporan voices, turning localized pain into global protest movements. Through Twitter Spaces, Zoom town halls, Clubhouse debates, and viral YouTube channels, diaspora activists now influence international media coverage, diaspora voting behavior in host countries, donor policy, and even lobbying efforts within Western parliaments. Groups such as the Concerned Nigerians in Diaspora, CND, Africans Rising, and Noctra Free the North movement have developed detailed security reports written to the US Congress and UK Parliament and organized peaceful demonstrations in global capitals to demand justice for kidnapped children and victims of state failure. This digital activism is not just performative, it's reshaping geopolitical pressure and restoring the dignity of unheard communities. Bridging the tech divide, diaspora innovators, creating security solutions. In response to the crisis of insecurity, diaspora-led tech innovation is quietly transforming how communities respond and recover. Across the continent, tech-savvy African immigrants are leveraging their skills to develop mobile panic alert apps such as MySafe App NG and Yagera SOS that connect users to emergency contacts or community watch groups. Blockchain-based missing persons registries to track, report, and verify abductions in real time. Digital storytelling platforms such as African Voices for Justice, which archive survivor stories and create advocacy toolkits. AI crime mapping systems, which predict high-risk abduction zones using data analytics, climate patterns, and social media reports. These innovations often emerge from diaspora incubators, tech fellowships, or academic research labs, and are piloted in collaboration with NGOs, churches, mosques, or local governments. Yet they are frequently undervalued by African states who see diaspora activism as either threatening or unpatriotic. Such perspectives must change. The diaspora is no longer an external observer. It is a strategic partner in the continent's survival. A silent crisis within the diaspora, trauma by proximity. It is important to note that diaspora activism does not come without emotional cost. Many Africans abroad suffer from what psychologists term vicarious trauma, the psychological impact of witnessing pain from afar, feeling helpless, and experiencing guilt over safety and distance. For every call received at midnight about an abducted cousin, for every video watched of a funeral back home, for every failed wire transfer to a brother hiding in the bush, a silent layer of trauma forms. Diaspora communities often lack culturally sensitive mental health services, and many suffer in silence, especially first-generation immigrants who feel trapped between grief and obligation. Reimagining diaspora-state relations from estrangement to partnership. For African governments to truly harness the full potential of the diaspora in responding to insecurity, the relationship must shift from transactional to transformational. This means establishing diaspora security and crisis response desks at embassies, including diaspora representatives in national security consultations, recognizing diaspora media and platforms as legitimate civil society voices, not enemies of the state, creating legal frameworks to facilitate diaspora crowdsourced security funds, and inviting diaspora experts to co-develop public security policies, technologies, and communication strategies. The brain drain can become a brain bridge if governments abandon paranoia and embrace partnership. Global Africans, local impact, a future built on solidarity. Whether funding ransom rescue, exposing abuses, building apps, or preserving the memory of the missing, the African diaspora is doing what many home governments have failed to do: show up, speak up, and stand up for the people. This should not be the exception. It should be the foundation of a new Africa, where citizenship is defined not by geography alone, but by responsibility, connection, and shared purpose. From the epicenter, voices from Nigeria's northwest, the human cost of state failure. In this final installment of The Bold African Voice, BAV's deep dive into the crisis of insecurity and abductions across Africa, we bring you the raw, unfiltered accounts from communities at ground zero of the catastrophe, Nigeria's northwest, where the shadows of terrorism, banditry, and systemic neglect converge in tragic harmony. From Katsina to Zamfara, Kaduna to Sokoto, villages once known for peaceful farming and communal life now bear the scars of perpetual fear. Children no longer attend school. Traders abandon markets by dusk. Residents sleep in forests to avoid midnight raids. In many of these areas, government is absent, law is distant, and justice is a stranger. A village that sleeps with one eye open. In the farming community of Dansadao, Zamfara State, elders recount how the area lost over 150 residents to abductions and raids in the last 2 years. They describe how women were kidnapped while harvesting crops, how schoolboys were taken from dormitories at gunpoint, and how ransom payments have bankrupted entire communities. "We sold our harvest, sold our cows, sold even our wives' jewelry," says 62-year-old Malam Sule, a local imam. But some captives never came back. Some were executed when the money came late. Others are still there. We don't even know if they are dead or alive. In many towns like Dansadao, it is the elders, youth, and women's cooperatives who have taken up community defense as government security forces remain under-equipped, overstretched, or simply disinterested. Voices from the barracks, soldiers on the brink. The human cost extends to Nigeria's own security forces. Young soldiers deployed to volatile regions tell of being sent into battle with inadequate weapons, unpaid allowances, and no insurance for their families. Many speak anonymously for fear of reprisal, but confess feelings of frustration, betrayal, and helplessness. We are outgunned and outnumbered. Sometimes we chase bandits through thick forest with no air support. When we get injured, we're told to treat ourselves, one soldier shared in a WhatsApp voice note to BAV. Yet when a general is kidnapped, helicopters and media are activated immediately. Are we not Nigerian too? This sense of hierarchical injustice within the military not only weakens morale but creates resentment toward leadership, breeding internal fractures within the institutions tasked with national defense. Advice to African leaders. A final appeal from the bold African voice. After months of investigation, interviews, policy analysis, and field reporting, the crisis is clear. Africa's abduction epidemic is not just a security failure, it is a moral failure, a leadership failure, and a failure of imagination. To African leaders, the time for rhetorical condemnation is over. The people are watching, bleeding, and waiting. Here is our message, rooted in the stories we've told and the truths we've uncovered. 1. Prioritize human security over political optics. Stop investing more in regime preservation than in citizen protection. The true legitimacy of any leadership lies in its ability to keep its people safe, not in photo ops, media statements, or election victories. 2. End the culture of selective justice. When generals are rescued and villagers are abandoned, you divide your nation into the protected and the forgotten. Every life must matter. Build systems that treat every abduction, rich or poor, child or elder, as a national emergency. 3. Strengthen institutions, not individuals. Africa does not need more strong men. It needs strong institutions, independent police forces, accountable intelligence agencies, functional judicial systems, and local governments empowered to act swiftly. 4. Embrace the diaspora as allies, not enemies. The diaspora is a vast reserve of talent, innovation, and resources. Create formal pathways for diaspora engagement in security reform, victim support, and policy advocacy. Their distance does not diminish their relevance. 5. Protect the vulnerable and document the truth. Invest in trauma centers, forensic labs, missing persons registries, and safe return programs. Record every name, every disappearance, and every ransom paid. Let history not forget what leadership failed to prevent. In summary, the bold African voice speaks through this investigation. We uncovered the painful contours of a continent grappling with a booming abduction economy, fueled by impunity and digital innovation, institutional silence that buries the truth and protects the powerful diaspora resistance, driven by grief, hope, and obligation, communities that fight for survival in the absence of state protection, and a people whose voices have been silenced, distorted, or ignored, but never defeated. We have traveled from WhatsApp donation chains to unmarked graves, from encrypted ransom negotiations to the dusty roads of Zamfara, from global diplomatic passivity to the local pastor counseling survivors. What we found was not hopelessness, but a continent on the brink of a reckoning. The time to act is now. The dead are watching. The missing are waiting. The living are rising. End the silence. Reform the systems. Protect the people. This is the bold African voice. We will not stop speaking. Thank you for watching the Bold African Voice, BAV. If we stay silent, they'll write the narrative for us. But together, we can reclaim the truth. What are your thoughts on the Tsiga case? Do you believe the military's account or the general's? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the Bold African Voice, BAV, where your voice echoes across the continent. Click the notification bell so you never miss a powerful story, and join us again as we continue to speak truth to power, unapologetically.